In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be talking a little bit about light bows, bows, and great bows in Elden Ring, going into the pros and cons of them, talking about how each one, how they operate, why you might use one or another in your build. Obviously, this is a little bit different of a video than would be any of the other weapon videos that we've done, even though it's going to cover similar information, because bows don't have a moveset the way that other weapons do, so that is not a factor in here, and they have a very limited amount of weapon skills. So before we get into the weapons themselves, let's talk a little bit first about some of these weapon skills and what exactly they do. So first up, we have Barrage. Barrage is a weapon skill that gives you essentially a 33% damage penalty per arrow and reduced status effect buildup just a little bit, in exchange for a 50% increase in fire rate and costs 2 FP to use. So effectively, you're sacrificing damage per shot to be able to unleash more arrows in a very quick space of time, effectively. And I have made a few builds using this weapon skill, and I think the real strength of this weapon skill is at medium to short range because you can use it very quickly, and it excels, in my opinion, at status effect buildup, even though you have reduced status effect per shot. The fact that you can fire off so many arrows quickly in succession generally means that you're going to be able to apply statuses more easily than some of the other weapon skills. Moving on to Mighty Shot, this skill makes it so that you have 75% more damage versus a regular arrow and 75% more status effect versus a regular arrow that, may have a status effect if you're using one that does, as well as adding range to your arrows fired and dealing some damage through blocks for 6 FP. So this kind of removes the need for the arrows reach talisman on a lot of bows. If you're using that, you might not need that if you're using Mighty Shot a lot. And in my opinion, it's the go-to Ash of War if you are, early in the middle of the game or even late game when you're trying to pick off enemies with one arrow. It's a great way to conserve arrows because you tend to kill enemies more quickly with it and can sometimes one-shot them with it. And I think probably all in all, it's probably the best all-around Ash of War for a bow. So next we come to Enchanted Shot, and what this does is it increases the damage that you're going to do with that shot by 50%, as well as status effect buildup by 50%. It has about the same length of animation as Mighty Shot, looks very similar, but it also homes onto the target a bit and curves to hit them when needed. It can miss targets still if they're very, very quick, but it's good at hitting more mobile targets. So if you're fighting something a bit more mobile, you might have a hard time hitting it with Mighty Shot. Enchanted Shot might do better for you. It does cost more FP at 8 and deals less damage, so you're sacrificing damage and FP in order to try and hit something that's a bit more mobile. Sky Shot deals 33% more damage than a regular arrow and arcs very high into the sky, coming down onto the head of the target, though this cannot be used in places with a ceiling as it blocks the arrow, so you won't be able to use this indoors at all, pretty much. And what's great about this weapon skill is that headshots deal more damage than body shots, depending on the enemy type, of course. Some enemies are not weak or don't have a head area that's weak. So this isn't always true, but when you hit the head of the enemy using Sky Shot, it will actually outperform Mighty Shot in terms of overall damage, because Mighty Shot always locks onto the torso-ish of the enemy or a body part like the leg or arm or something like that. So you're always getting body shot damage with Mighty Shot, whereas you tend to get more headshots with Sky Shot. So it's more difficult to use, but the reward can be higher than Mighty Shot. The problem I find, though, is that depending on where you're positioned near an enemy, you tend to hit the back of their neck a lot. Like if you're behind an enemy and you're playing kind of stealthily and you shoot from behind them, and you're going to hit the back of their neck more often than not getting that headshot damage, but getting body shot instead. So you want to try and be on the side of the enemy or the front of the enemy when using this skill in order to get maximum damage. So then we come to Rain of Arrows, and what this skill does is it deals 50% less damage and status effect buildup, but it sort of splits your arrow into multiple arrows that come down on the target, hitting them multiple times. And when it hits them multiple times, this adds up to over 100% damage most of the time, particularly on large targets. So you tend to get more damage and more status effect buildup when using this versus other weapon skills, and it's probably, the pound for pound king of damage when it comes to weapon skills, and that's why it costs 20 FP, because you're doing more damage on average, and so therefore it costs more FP to use. And what I really love about Rain of Arrows is it's the only weapon skill that you can use on light bows, bows, or great bows, so it's universal across all of them. And you might be thinking, Well, if I use it on Greatbows, I'm going to do more damage, so that's the only reason you should use it. You should only use it on a Greatbow. But there are no bleed arrows on Greatbows. Greatbows do not have bleed arrows, so the reason you might want to use it on a bow or a light bow is because you could use bleed arrows and therefore set bleeding rather easily on a lot of targets. So consider that when trying to decide whether you want to use a Greatbow or a bow. And then lastly, we come to through and through. This can only be used on Greatbows, so you're only going to be able to use this on Greatbows. And this does 30% more damage with great arrows and pierces the target, hitting enemies behind the target, cost 9 FP. So essentially, this is a more expensive Mighty Shot, kind of, but doesn't deal as much damage as Mighty Shot, but it can hit arrows, hit enemies in a line. So the cons are that, generally speaking, you're not hitting enemies in a line in this game. So I'm not a huge fan of through and through in general, but it does have its uses in some areas. So let's take a look at light bows first. We'll get into the pros and cons of this weapon group before we start looking at the individual weapons. Pros of this weapon group are that they have fast attack speed. You can jump and shoot, land and shoot, sprint and shoot, roll and shoot very quickly with this weapon group. You can't do this with bows or great bows, meaning that this weapon type, if you're going to be playing close range with a bow, is the weapon type to use. You're not going to do this with a bow or a great bow. Also, most light bows can be found extremely early on in Elden Ring, allowing you to play this weapon style very quickly. They're very lightweight, making it easy to manage your weight. And they have the highest versatility of Ashes of War of all bow types. They can use 5 of the 6 weapon skills that bows can use, so that's another big pro for this weapon group. The downsides of this weapon group are that they have lower damage per shot than all other bow type weapons. They have the shortest range of all bow type weapons by about half. And they have extremely poor scaling, meaning you don't get a lot of damage out of investing points into strength and dexterity compared to other weapons in Elden Ring. Bows and great bows and light bows in general all have pretty bad scaling. As you get, down to great bows, the scaling does get better, but I wouldn't call them fantastic by any means. So let's take a look at the harp bow first. The harp bow does physical damage, and it's the lightest bow in Elden Ring weighing 2. It requires 9 strength and 9 dexterity in order to use effectively. The harp bow is the lightest bow and has very low stat requirements, but you won't get it until a ways into the game in the Shaded Castle. You cannot change its weapon skill Barrage, and it has the lowest damage of all light bows by a lot. This weapon scales slightly better with dexterity than strength, but not by a lot, and has poor scaling in general, so I would avoid worrying about adding damage through scaling with this weapon. The only real reason to use this weapon is because it makes a harp sound when firing arrows, allowing you to live out your bardic archer fantasy. Up next is the short bow. The short bow does physical damage and has an average weight for a light bow in Elden Ring weighing 2.5. It requires 8 strength and 10 dexterity in order to use effectively. The short bow has the second lowest damage of all light bows and has terrible scaling, but can be acquired at the very beginning of the game. It has very low requirements, and you can change its Ash of War. This weapon scales identically with either strength or dexterity, meaning you can use it in either a strength or dex build until you find a better weapon, but has poor scaling in general. The best reason to use this weapon is its ease of acquisition at the very beginning of the game and the fact that anyone can use it with little stat investment, but you will definitely want to swap this out for a stronger light bow when you find one. Up next is the Red Branch Short Bow. The Red Branch Short Bow does physical damage and has an average weight for a light bow in Elden Ring weighing 2.5, and it requires 8 strength and 16 dexterity in order to use effectively. The Red Branch Shortbow can be acquired in Tombsword Ruins early on. You can change its Ash of War, and it has almost no strength requirements, making it a good choice if you're going for a pure dex build. However, it is outclassed by the Black Bow, damage and range-wise, making it a better choice if you don't mind the extra 1.5 weight. The Red Branch Shortbow scales slightly better with dexterity than strength, making it better on dex builds than strength, but not by a lot. However, since it has a 16 dexterity requirement, it's a natural choice for early game dex builds. Up next is the Composite Bow. The Composite Bow does physical damage and is tied for the heaviest light bow in Elden Ring weighing 3. It requires 15 strength and 15 dexterity in order to use effectively. The Composite Bow can be acquired from a merchant in Learning of the Lakes. You can change its Ash of War, and it has the second highest attack rating of all light bows. However, it is the heaviest light bow at 3 and has the highest requirements of all light bows, though again this is slightly misleading because you really only need 2/3 the listed strength to use any bow weapon. The Composite Bow scales slightly better with dexterity than strength, making it another good choice for dexterity builds despite its higher strength requirement. However, if you've already been upgrading the Red Branch Short Bow, You might want to wait in order to get the black bow that is better than both these light bows. And the last light bow is the Misbegotten short bow. The Misbegotten short bow does physical damage and is tied for the heaviest light bow in Elden Ring, weighing 3. It requires 16 strength and 8 dexterity in order to use effectively. Just keep in mind again that you only need 2/3 the strength to actually wield this, so this is actually 11 strength. The Misbegotten short bow has the highest damage of all light bows. It has better scaling than all light bows. You can change its Ash of War, and you can farm it easily in Weeping Peninsula. However, it is tied for the heaviest light bow at 3, and it has shorter range than all other light bows, though not by a ton. The Misbegotten short bow scales very slightly better with strength and dexterity, making it a good choice for strength builds that want a ranged option, at least until you can upgrade to the black bow. And just before we get into the bows themselves, one thing that I want to mention that I probably should have mentioned earlier is that light bows, bows, and great bows have what is called a range in this game, and that affects the damage that they deal. When you get outside of the range of a bow, you start getting less and less damage the further away you get from the target, and it's a sliding scale. So you're not going to like take one step out of range and do half damage. You're going to take one step out of range and do 95% damage or 90% damage. And the further away you get, the less damage you're going to get. So the longer range your bow has, the more distance you can have between you and the target and still maintain 100% damage. Note that this doesn't apply to status effect buildup if you're using like bleed arrows or something like that. The status effect buildup remains the same, but the damage of that arrow will go down, when you hit the target with the arrow itself. And one of the things about short bows, which is why I'm mentioning it here, is that because short bows have such short range compared to both bows and great bows, they have half the range on average, or just about half the range. It's like 60% of the range. That the arrow's reach talisman is almost a must when using this weapon if you want to use it anything other than like very, very close to your target. So if you're using light bows in this game, I highly recommend equipping using the arrow's reach talisman in order to extend your range and to keep your damage high even when you're at longer ranges. So next we'll get into the pros and cons of bows before we get into each of the 7 bows. And the first thing to note is that they have a higher attack rating than light bows, so that's a good reason to use them. They have more versatility in Ashes of War compared to great bows, so there's a little bit more flexibility there even though they have lower damage than great bows. They're only slightly heavier than light bows in general, so they really don't weigh that much. And they have the same range as great bows, so there isn't like a range discrepancy between great bows and regular bows. The cons of this weapon group are that they can't jump and shoot and land and shoot and sprint and shoot and roll and shoot like light bows can. So they're much harder to use in close range proximity compared to light bows. And there are not too many long bows or regular bows early on in the game, so you're not going to be able to find too many of these early on. So first up is the horn bow. The horn bow does physical and magic damage and is tied for the second heaviest bow in Elden Ring, weighing 4.5. It requires 10 strength, 14 dexterity, and 12 intelligence in order to use effectively. The horn bow is arguably the worst bow in Elden Ring, and it does terrible damage compared to most other bows in just about every instance. However, you can change its Ash of War. You can find it pretty early on in Shifa River, and it increases the damage ratio of dwelling arrows to more magic damage, allowing you to boost their damage more easily with things like Magic Scorpion Charm, Magic Shroud and Crack Tier, and Terra Magica. This weapon scales the best with dexterity up to 50, then strength, and int scales horribly with this weapon, which is a shame as this can help boost magic damage. If you're going to use this weapon, you pretty much must use dwelling arrows exclusively, or you might as well use another bow. However, since the scaling is mostly dexterity, you could use a second bow with regular arrows and swap to this one when you want to deal magic damage with dwelling arrows, without sacrificing damage on the other bow. Up next is the Serpent Bow. The Serpent Bow does physical damage and is the lightest bow in Elden Ring, weighing 3.5. It requires 8 strength, 15 dexterity, and 11 arcane in order to use effectively. The Serpent Bow is a strange weapon. It adds 15 poison buildup on any arrow it fires. It's the lightest bow in Elden Ring, and its native arcane scaling means that arrows fired from it like blood, poison, or sleep arrows will have more buildup than other bows. However, and this is a big however, placing points into arcane for this weapon does not increase arrow damage and only increases status effect buildup. This means you must choose between more damage or more status effects with your arrows, and since even when optimized for the most damage possible, the Serpent Bow still has lower damage than other bows, you should really only be using this weapon if you plan to go the status effect route. Mighty Shot does not make this easy in close quarter boss fights though, and you cannot roll and shoot or land and shoot like a light bow, making this a tricky bow to use. Next is the longbow. The longbow does physical damage and is tied for the second lightest bow in Elden Ring, weighing 4. It requires 9 strength and 14 dexterity in order to use effectively. The longbow is a solid all-around bow. It does decent damage, you can acquire it very early in Round Table Hold, and it's one of 3 bows that can change Ashes of War. The scaling on it is very slightly better with dexterity than strength, making it viable for either type of build. It's the best bow you can use early on in the game if you want to swap out Mighty Shot for Rain of Arrows, but eventually you'll want to replace it with the Albinauric bow. Up next is the black bow. The black bow does physical damage and is tied for the second lightest bow in Elden Ring, weighing 4. It requires 9 strength and 20 dexterity in order to use effectively. The black bow is unique for a bow since it operates identically to a light bow, except it's a bit heavier and has much better range. It also has very low damage for a bow, which is better than all light bows, but worse than nearly every other bow, and has barrage as its weapon skill, just like a light bow. This weapon scales slightly better with dexterity than strength, but not by much, making it suited for either type of build. The scaling of this weapon is better than light bows and some bows, but it's not great in general. Up next is the pulley bow. The pulley bow does physical damage and is the heaviest bow in Elden Ring, weighing 5. It requires 11 strength and 11 dexterity in order to use effectively. The pulley bow is fantastic. It has the best range of all bow-type weapons in Elden Ring. It has the lowest requirements of all bows and has the highest damage on average of all bows. However, you don't get it until the Mount Gelmor area of the game, and it's the heaviest bow in Elden Ring. Scaling-wise, Dex is just ever so slightly ahead of Strength, making it perfectly viable for both types of builds, and it does have the best scaling of all bows, so investing points is definitely worth it. Up next is the Erdtree Bow. The Erdtree Bow does physical and holy damage and is tied for the second lightest bow in Elden Ring, weighing 4. It requires 8 strength, 12 dexterity, and 14 faith in order to use effectively. The Erdtree Bow is interesting because it does increase damage with both fire and golden arrows due to faith scaling, though performs much better with golden arrows than fire. And this damage is higher than any other bow in Elden Ring when only using golden arrows. The downside is that you cannot find this weapon until the Lendo Royal capital. Holy damage is resisted by a lot of endgame bosses, and when you don't use fire or golden arrows, this bow deals the lowest per shot damage of any bow in Elden Ring. Scaling-wise, it scales best up to 80 faith with minimum points in strength and dexterity, making it perfect for faith builds that spellcast, wanting a long-range way of picking off enemies. This also allows you to use Golden Vow, Flame Grant Me Strength, or Howl of Shabriri easily, further increasing your damage. And lastly, we come to the Albinauric Bow. The Albinauric Bow does physical damage and is tied for the second heaviest bow in Elden Ring, weighing 4.5. It requires 7 strength and 18 dexterity in order to use effectively. The Albinauric Bow is often overlooked by many would-be bow users, and that's probably because you cannot get it until the consecrated snowfields, and it can take some time to farm. However, it has the highest damage of any bow that can use Rain of Arrows, and it has the highest base damage of all bows, so it doesn't rely as much on scaling as the pulley bow. The scaling of this weapon is mostly dex, making this arguably the best choice of bow when playing a dex build if you don't want to use Mighty Shot or Barrage. And this brings us to Greatbows. Greatbows have the highest attack rating of all bow-type weapons. They're the only weapon type that can use through and through. They can all be found in the first half of the game, and they're tied with bows for the longest range of all bow-type weapons. The negatives of this weapon group are that they're much heavier than other bow-type weapons, in some cases weighing double or triple. They have the longest draw time of all the bow-type weapons. They have a very limited weapon skill selection. There's only 2 that you can use. And their ammo capacity is about a third of what other bow-type weapons have. So let's get into the Greatbows themselves. First is the Erdtree Greatbow. The Erdtree Greatbow does physical and holy damage. It is the second heaviest Greatbow in Elden Ring, weighing 11. And it requires 20 strength, 14 dexterity, and 14 faith in order to use effectively. Just remember that you only need 2/3 the strength value in order to use any bow-type weapon, so this would be 14 in this case. The Erdtree Greatbow is by far the worst of the Greatbows, except when using Golden Great Arrows and when using the Sacred Scorpion Charm and Holy Shouting Crack tier all together. This combo allows it to catch up to the Greatbow and Lion Greatbow in per arrow damage, but you have to have these things to pull this off. However, you can get this Greatbow earlier than any other Greatbow in the game. It has the lowest requirements of all Greatbows, and native faith scaling allows you to buff with Golden Vow easily, pushing your damage up to the Golem Greatbow when using it. Through and through is not likely to benefit you as much with this weapon, as the damage is much lower than other Greatbows, particularly since 9 FP is not a small amount early game. I don't recommend using it if you've grabbed this bow early on, but if you're later in the game and have more FP and proper spacing, you definitely should when needed. This weapon scales better with Faith up to 50, then Strength, and then Dexterity, making this a good pairing with Strength Faith builds, and Golden Great Arrows scale with Faith, so you should prioritize this before Strength. Additionally, the scaling of this weapon is poor in general compared to other Greatbows, so you shouldn't focus on increasing your stats to maximize its damage, but rather on what other weapon you're using. Next is the Greatbow itself. The Greatbow deals physical damage and is the second lightest Greatbow in Elden Ring, weighing 10. It requires 20 strength and 20 dexterity in order to use effectively. The Greatbow is not the worst Greatbow, even though it deals less damage than all but the Erdtree Greatbow. However, it can be infused with Rain of Arrows if you don't like Through and Through, and does slightly less damage than Radahn's Rain when fully buffed, but slightly more damage when not buffed with Exalted Flesh or Flame Grant Me Strength. Through and Through does about 30% more damage for 9 FP, which I covered earlier, which is not a terrible trade if you have the time and FP to use it, as it takes a bit longer to set up than a normal shot on a Greatbow. The damage Through and Through deals on the Greatbow is about 15% less than the Golem Greatbow does when using the same weapon skill, and about the same as the Erdtree Greatbow does when using the same weapon skill when using the Sacred Scorpion Charm, Holy Shroud and Cracked Tear, and Golden Great Arrows on that weapon. The Greatbow has the same scaling for both strength and dexterity, allowing you to use it in either type of build effectively, but getting the most damage out of it requires a quality build. Next is the Golem Greatbow. The Golem Greatbow does physical damage and is the heaviest Greatbow in Elden Ring, weighing a whopping 14.5. It requires 24 strength and 18 dexterity in order to use effectively. The Golem Greatbow is the pound-for-pound king of Greatbows if you're talking about per-shot damage or through-and-through damage, and you can also get it rather early on in the game by farming golems that use bows in Limgrave. However, it is the heaviest Greatbow by a good margin, making it hard to use early on when trying to manage your weight. Through and Through does more damage with this weapon than any other Greatbow, but the downside is that you cannot change to Rain of Arrows when you want for certain bosses or enemies. This means if you like Rain of Arrows, you should either use the Greatbow or Lion Greatbow, despite their lower per-shot damage. This weapon scales very slightly better with strength and dexterity, making it viable for both types of builds. However, to get the most from this weapon, you'll need to go the quality route, so keep in mind when using this. Since it has the best scaling of all bow-type weapons in Elden Ring, you definitely should consider doing this when using this weapon. And finally, we come to the Lion Greatbow. The Lion Greatbow does physical damage and is the lightest Greatbow in Elden Ring, weighing 9.5. Requires 22 strength and 18 dexterity in order to use effectively. The Lion Greatbow is solid. It has excellent base damage and scaling considering it's the lightest Greatbow, and it visually looks better than the other 3 Greatbows. It also natively increases Radahn's spear damage by 20%, and if you hold a second Lion Greatbow in your offhand, you can double this bonus. Radahn's Rain is a solid weapon skill and can hit for over 3k damage when fully buffed and using Radahn's spears as ammo. It's great for co-op when someone has a boss distracted or for leading off a fight against difficult enemies that haven't seen you yet. It's easily the best weapon skill of Greatbows, typically being slightly better than Rain of Arrows when fully buffed. The Lion Greatbow has nearly identical scaling with strength and dexterity, making it viable for both types of builds. But just like the Golem Greatbow, you'll need to build for quality if you want to get the most damage from it, and it does have relatively good scaling, so putting points for damage is worth it. And the last thing I want to cover before we wrap up this video is talismans that work with bows. There are a staple group of talismans that work with bows that I'm going to go through, and these are the Arrow Sting Talisman, which increases the damage that your arrows deal. This is pretty much a must-have on any bow build, as it's going to just give you a 10% increase in damage. So if you're playing a bow build, you'll absolutely want to have this one equipped. The Arrow's Reach Talisman increases the range of your weapon. Now, what I find is that if you're using a light bow, this is pretty much a must-have unless you're using the black bow, which again is not a light bow, but has double the range or almost double the range of a light bow. So if you're using the black bow, you probably don't need to use the Arrow's Reach Talisman. But if you're using any light bow, you should definitely have this one on it, or you'll probably see a noticeable drop-off in your damage. I don't think the Arrow's Reach Talisman is needed on any bow that has 50 range, particularly if you're using Mighty Shot on that bow, because that will extend the range of that particular shot anyway. So I think you can fill this slot with something else, unless you're, going for very, very long distance shots. Ritual Sword Talisman increases your attack power by 10% when you're at full health. This also applies to bow attacks, so this is pretty much a staple. It's also a staple in mage builds for the same reason, just giving you that 10% increase in damage. Shard of Alexander or Warrior Jar Shard will boost the damage of your weapon skills, and since you typically use weapon skills a lot on bows, and there are few talismans that increase your damage on bows, this is definitely one that you should consider using on any bow build. The Blue Dancer charm can also increase your attack power the lower your equip load is, so if you want to play a very light mobile bow build to try and maximize your damage with the least amount of protection, you can absolutely use the Blue Dancer charm. And lastly, the Spear Talisman increases piercing damage against enemies that are attacking you. Really the best time to use this, in my opinion, is if you're using a light bow and you bait an enemy into attacking you and you jump and shoot them or roll and shoot them while they're mid-attack animation. So definitely consider this on any light bow build, and maybe, you know, other builds as well where you tend to hit enemies that are attacking you, but generally this will be light bow builds. And keep in mind this only applies to physical damage, so if you're using this, you should be using physical damage arrows. So that wraps up our video on light bows, bows, and great bows. I hope you guys learned something. This was a ton of fun to do. There was a lot to this one. Sorry it took so long. I will be doing another video on staffs and another video on seals, going through the breakpoints on where they shine scaling wise, when you might consider using each staff. And obviously we'll work in some more builds as well, and we'll do some more coverage, also other videos leading up to the launch of Shatter the Erdtree in just over 2 weeks. As always, if you guys have further tips for bow users, if there's something I forgot to mention, or if you have questions, please leave them in the comments below.